Hopefully that's right now. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Newcastle Institute on this cool Wednesday evening. We appreciate you coming out on such a cold night. As many of you know, we are a public policy discussion forum where we try not to take a position on either side of politics. We try to discuss the important political issues. I'll say this up front, if anyone wants to join the organising committee, we're always more than welcome. You're always more than welcome to join a group, some of whom are here tonight, trying to sort out the technology. And luckily we've got two people over there that are much more technologically intelligent than I am, so hopefully it goes okay. We're standing on the land of the Awabakal and Worimi peoples, and for thousands of years they've been learning, discussing, talking about a range of issues. So we hope to stand in their footsteps, and we want to continue that sort of approach of sharing knowledge and skills about a whole range of issues that affect our communities. Tonight we're going to focus on the housing crisis, challenges and solutions as well. The housing crisis has really come to the fore through COVID, although I don't think it was non-existent before COVID. It was certainly a problem before COVID, but COVID has certainly highlighted some of those challenges. It has many faces. We may traditionally view it in terms of those who are sleeping rough in our streets. We don't necessarily see the couch surfing that goes on, but we also see rough sleeping and a whole range of other facets of the housing crisis. There's a number of reasons that these evidence suggests are contributing to the housing crisis. Certainly increasing demand for a limited supply of rental properties and for social housing and low-cost housing. Increasing homelessness, evidenced by those things like rough sleeping and couch surfing. Housing and rental prices out of reach of many in our community, and reliance on social housing, funded by government mainly, to meet of those needs of those people who can't afford to buy or rent a house. So there's a whole range of contributions. Women, and especially older women, experiencing the challenges of finding affordable housing disproportionately to others in the community. And youth are also experiencing those challenges. I think it's sad to hear when young people who have said to me recently, I don't think I'll ever be able to afford to buy a house. And these people are graduates, potentially earning good money when they finish university or at TAFE courses, and they don't see that they'll ever be in a position to do that. And indeed, some of their friends are currently experiencing some form of homelessness. That traditional approach of reliance on government-funded social housing has lengthy waiting times, so people are waiting up to 20 years to be able to access that. And when you're facing a housing crisis, that is no solution to those people. We're going to examine the housing crisis tonight, and we're lucky we've got three experts in the field. And what we want to do is present the face of the housing crisis. And we've got Nicole Grgas here, who is the coordinator at the Tenants Advice and Advocacy Service. And she's going to describe that face of the housing crisis and sees those challenges that people experience and advocates on their behalf on a day-to-day basis in the Hunter. We then have Professor David Adamson, who's on our screen. So David was in Newcastle and is now in Adelaide, and so he's joining us from there tonight via Zoom. David has a very diverse career, but particularly looking at housing and housing models across the world, really, with international experience. He's currently the Compass Housing Services, it's now One Home in Place. It used to be Compass, Chief Strategic Engagement Officer, and a worldwide expert on housing and sustainability. He's also Emeritus Professor at the University of New South Wales and Honorary Professor at the University of Newcastle, with a long career focused on housing and sustainability. Our last speaker is Sidsel Grimstad on my left over there, who's also had a diverse career. When I read her bio, it was interesting that she was looking, a common theme is exploring cooperative actions, but particularly at a environmental sustainability perspective. And while you may think, well, is housing really about environmental sustainability, the importance of Sidsel's work over the years has really been on looking at the interaction and collaboration and cooperative approach of small business and environment to achieve outcomes. So she's now looking at the potential of cooperative housing as an alternative solution to the housing crisis. So we have a broad perspective tonight. Each one is going to present for some time, and then at the end we'll have an opportunity for questions. Okay, so please join me in welcoming Nicole first, who's going to describe the face of the housing crisis.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? No? I'm very short. Thank you for the invitation. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we meet this evening, and my fellow panel members. Excuse me too, I have been unwell last week, but on the mend. So, who are we? I'm the coordinator of the Tenants Advice Service in Newcastle. Tenants Advice Services are state government funded, but we're community managed organisations. So we're part of a statewide program, but we cover the whole Hunter area. So from Foster to Murrurundi, Merewether and Lake Macquarie. So we're currently funded for 4.5 staff to cover that area, so we're spread very thinly. And at the moment, we only have secure funding until June 2023. So it's a difficult environment to be working in. We're funded to provide advice and assistance to all tenants. So not only people in private rental, those people who live in social housing, in caravan parks and in boarding houses, which is quite a broad range of people. We're not funded to do systemic advocacy, so it's a bit of a misnomer, I suppose, because people think about advocacy, when they see tenants advice and advocacy, they're thinking that we do systemic. Generally, we're funded to do individual advocacy for tenants with specific issues, but we do feed into the Tenants Union of New South Wales, and they have a policy and law reform team. So the things that we see on the ground in our areas, we feed back to the Tenants Union in the hope that there might be some policy platforms that go up that make a difference for our communities. Personally, I've worked as a tenant advocate for 23 years. I started when I was very young, and I've been the manager for 11 years. I would have to say that the last couple of years have been the most challenging time to work as a tenant advocate, and I think most people who work in the community sector would be saying the same thing. It's really hard slog because what we're seeing is the most vulnerable being left behind. I jumped the gun, but we do provide telephone advice for tenants. We do the direct advocacy with landlords, housing providers, caravan park operators, and boarding house owners. So we might, have a chat to a tenant, think that maybe something can be conciliated, but obviously the parties aren't really getting on. Sometimes we can be a little bit of a circuit breaker to stop things from toppling over. We try and provide, because we've got such a high demand, a lot of what we do is actually resource tenants with capacity to try and take courage of their own matter. So we'll give them some resources. We'll tell them what the law says. We tell them how we've seen the law applied by the tribunal, and we'll give them the resources to try and resolve those issues that they're having without that involvement of other parties or getting to a tribunal. We also do a lot of liaison and with community organisations to try and ensure that people know that we're here, that we're available to provide that advice. And we do education with tenants on their rights. Excuse me. Oh, I'm very sorry, that turned out very dark, but you don't need to read it, it's fine. Well, I just want to do a really brief about what we know, and potentially you may know this or you may hear it a couple of times this evening, but the latest census data demonstrates that more than 30% of our community are now renters, and that's increasing. In New South Wales, we have over 2 million households that are renting in the private rental market, and only 4.7% of our rental housing stock is social housing. We currently have more than 50,000 households on the social housing register or the wait list, and we, for our area in the Hunter, 10 years plus is what we're looking at to secure social housing. Census data also shows that there's been an increase of people who are paying more than 30% of their income towards rent. And this is probably going to be housing costs, not just in rent for people who are renting. We know that housing costs are increasing. But the 30% is an indicator of housing stress. And the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare has released a report that says that in New South Wales, half of the people who are receiving Commonwealth rent assistance are still in housing stress. So the program that's meant to assist people to retain tenancies in the private market is failing. What we're seeing in our area is exceptionally low vacancy rates. So we're a little bit better in June than we have been, but in March, the Hunter region itself, 0.5% vacancy rate. And we're looking at about 0.8 at the moment. But vacancy rates aren't always a great picture because it doesn't differentiate between what's affordable, what we would consider affordable, and what isn't. So we know that when we talk to tenants or when we talk to homelessness services, what they're saying is there is no affordable housing for someone on benefits. There is no housing. It's pretty dire. We know that there's also been a loss of housing stock during COVID, and anecdotally, and we're starting to see a bit more data on that, it's a lot of people who are moving to our area because it's so wonderful, and are buying up to owner-occupy. We are also seeing the impacts of short-term holiday rentals. So we're losing housing stock to those stays, Airbnb. And, I was just interested in this, and on census night, there were over 2,000 properties unoccupied in Port Stephens, 1,700 in Cessnock, and over 800 in Newcastle. And in the Mid-Coast Council area, so I cover part of the Mid-Coast, more than 2,700 vacant properties. So it's an indicator that there's housing there, and it's just not being used for what we need it for right now. It's a difficult question, but I think it's important to examine it. The other things that we are seeing is, even though it may not be something that landlords are asking for, we're seeing rental bidding. So if you go to an open home and there's 40 people who want to apply for that home, we are seeing more often people who have the capacity or who may be able to stretch their budget that little bit more, offering more than the advertised price to secure the property. Or especially in our lockdowns, when people were moving out of the cities, people were offering 6 months rent in advance, which is a big carrot for someone who's leasing their property. We're seeing an increasing number of older people who are facing homelessness. And we're also talking to a lot of people who are having to surrender their pets to try and secure a rental property. And for a lot of people who are on their own, for a lot of people who have mental health issues and disabilities, a pet is such an important part of their life. I mean, it is for a family as well. But so I think that the fact that we have blanket no pet clauses in our tenancy, or the allowable ability of no pets, makes it very difficult. Sorry, I didn't say that very eloquently. So, as a tenancy service, we can only answer so many calls, but we've definitely had an increase in our demand on our services. Matters are more complex. People are more complex. A lot of people have a lot going on in their lives and don't have a great capacity to work through what's going on. So we're part-time counsellors as well. We're seeing a really high increase in the number of tenants who are facing no grounds, eviction for no grounds or sale of premises. So in New South Wales, a landlord, and some of you may be landlords and know this, a landlord can issue a notice to vacate without any reason. So you could be a tenant that's lived in a premises for some time, never defaulted on rent, always looked after the premises. A landlord can still give a notice and say, I want you to go now, and you have to go eventually. So we think that there's some potential to tighten that up. So of course a landlord has a right to make decisions about what they do with their property, but if you are giving the right of someone to use it as a home, then there should be some reasons, we believe, to say, I want you to leave now, not just leave now. Currently, 47% of the inquiries that we do relate to people who have notice of termination, and that's increased significantly. It's I think it's about a 15% increase from pre-COVID times. The other thing that we are seeing, which is having a massive impact on our community, are rent increases. And, you know, 3 years ago, someone might call and say, my rent's going up $20. And we would, you know, talk through the process, because $20 in Newcastle 3 years ago was still a significant rent increase. At the moment, we're talking to people, like today, I was at the Homeless Connect Day, which is, we talked to a lot of people, and a young woman spoke to me, and she had a $100 rent increase, and she was on a payment. So it's not unusual now to be seeing rent increases of that level. And our tenancy law doesn't limit rent increases, except to basically link it with the market. So at the moment, it's not a good time to be a tenant. When we talk to people about their rent increases, even when we talk about the potential to challenge it, they frequently won't, because they're fearful that they will get a no grounds notice. And that goes for any asserting any of their rights. Someone will say, my toilet's leaking, or my roof is leaking, what can I do? And then when we go through the process, can the landlord give me a notice? And there's a very small protection in tenancy law, but it's not great. So tenants are fearful of eviction all the time. They're fearful of rent increases, and they're not asserting their rights. And when they do have a notice of termination, for whatever reason, they're finding it extremely difficult to find somewhere to go. I didn't number my pages. Rookie mistake. Beyond the rent increase issue, we know that there's a really high increase or significant increase in other costs of living. And so people are going into debt to try and maintain their housing, which is, creating problems. It's the robbing Peter to pay Paul. It just never balances out. And so we do a lot of referrals to charity organisations, and we talk about them going to their energy providers to get payment plans and things like that. So, excuse me. But at the end of the day, I've never talked to so many people who are exiting from a safe rental property to either temporary accommodation, into their car, into backyards, tents, or just couch surfing. So I wanted to talk about some stories of housing. That's just a few headlines that I had cut and paste, but it's really just a prop. And I wanted to talk about some stories that we've had of housing stress recently. Excuse me. On Monday this week, I did some tenancy advice, which I don't always do as a manager, but I spoke to a single mum on a disability support payment. She had just finished 3 years of treatment for cancer. They'd lived in their property for 11 years and had no issues. The rent was on time, the premises was in good order. She has 2 teenage daughters who are studying, and they've got some pets. They've been on the social housing waiting list for 3 years. Their home has sold. So what that means is, because they're not in a fixed term lease, been there for 11 years, 30 days notice. She had a look at the rental lists, and it's really clear that there's nothing that's going to be particularly affordable. And even if it is, the likelihood of her being accepted for a rental, because it's going to be much more than that 30% benchmark, the rents. So they're looking to rehome their pets, which has been one of her main comforts while she's been sick. They may have to separate as a family so they can all be safely housed. They're not a priority for social housing. There it is. And so what she said to me was, where will I go when the sheriff comes? Will I put my stuff? Where can I put my furniture? And, will I have to put my animals down? And these are the decisions that people are having to make frequently, and these are the stories that we're hearing day in, day out. And besides this stress, the cost of moving is high. The Tenants Union recently did a report about a whole bunch of this stuff, but one of the things that they calculated the cost of moving. And so for cities, it was just over $4,000. And for regional areas, it was about $6,000 cost. And that's thinking about, school uniforms. Like it's a whole gamut. How many people have that spare? Not many. Earlier this year, I spoke to a dad who had 2 kids. Both he and his wife were working, and they again had a no grounds, or maybe the house had sold. They could afford $600 a week rent, and they couldn't secure a rental. And it went to the tribunal, and the tribunal will give you a little bit more time, but not a lot, a couple of weeks, maybe 4. And so this family ended up putting all their furniture in his sister's garage, and they lived in a tent in the yard. 2 toddlers, mum and dad, working, could afford $600 a week. There's just no houses. So it's not just vulnerable, people on payments. It's right across the board. And one last story. We assisted some people recently who were in a premises that was subsidised by the National Rental Affordability Scheme. So that scheme gave incentives or subsidies for landlords to build and provide premises at a reduced, 70% of market rent. It lasted for 10 years. There was no exit plan. Government changed, no exits. So the people had lived there very happily for 10 years, and this lovely community had developed. Most of them were older people, and they ended up on the age pension or on disability payments, a couple working, but this beautiful community. And once the subsidy ended, $145 to $195 a week rent increases. And it's just, you kind of think, it's so morally wrong. And the landlord said, well, I'm not getting the subsidy anymore, and so that's what I can get in the market. And some of those premises went on the market, and they did rent out for that price because it's such a high need for housing. But what we're seeing then is the most vulnerable losing out again and again. And some of those ladies said to me, I'm not using the heater, I'm not turning the lights on, I need to go to the neighbourhood centre to get food, or my family are paying for my food bills because all of my payment goes towards the rent. And these are people who have worked their whole lives, retired, and not been able to buy. And so I guess it's just this frustration of, where do people go? What can we do? I don't know what happened there. Anyway, I can talk. I've had an issue with my slide. As a tenant advocate, I always think that there is room for law reform, and I think I've already kind of touched on them. Create some justifiable and verifiable, justified, just cause verifiable grounds. So somewhere like Victoria, there are specific reasons that a landlord can give a notice, and they ask also, if they're saying I need it for a renovation or I need to move in, they can't lease it out again for at least 6 months. Because one of the things we're seeing is churn. So someone will get a notice of termination for no grounds, and the landlord might say, my family need to move in, and then the next week it's back on the market for $200 more. So I think that we need to start saying, if someone has to leave their home, there should be some justified grounds, justifiable, verifiable grounds. The blanket no pet clauses creates a huge problem for people. And there are things that you can put in place that ensure that premises are still protected or landlords are protected from damage. Most people are responsible pet owners, I feel. And so, to say no pets is really meaning that over 30% potentially of our community can't have a pet. And I think it's time to introduce some levers to regulate rent increases, better regulate rent increases. And that's a contentious issue for landlords. But what we're seeing at the moment is just completely unsustainable for our community. We need an increase in investment in social and affordable housing. We need to invest in maintenance in social housing, because some of the social housing stock that we have is appalling. We need to slow the loss of rental housing to short-term holiday letting via some regulation. And I'm not an expert on this stuff, but I think that inclusionary zoning, so that new developments require there's a building of a more affordable housing stock, and adopting innovative models of housing and housing support, and a review of Commonwealth rent assistance to make sure it's fit for purpose. So thank you.
So we're going to have David present now. Hopefully the technology will work. And I will get the PowerPoint up. David, I'm not quite sure whether you probably can't see the PowerPoint that's up on the screen.
I can't, but I'm running it on my computer. So what I suggest is I'll ask you to advance the slides at the various points.
That's fine.
Yeah, and you can hear me okay?
Yep. Yep.
Okay, ready when you are then.
Okay, ready to go.
Okay, great. Okay. Well, apologies, I can't be there in person tonight. But I think, as Robin mentioned at the beginning, I'm now resident in Adelaide, and I'm only getting up to Newcastle occasionally, courtesy of COVID. My intentions were to be there much more frequently than has been possible. But I'm sure there are some familiar faces in the room. I can't actually see who is there, but it would have been good to have been there in person. I'd like to say that I join you from the traditional land of the Ghana people in Adelaide, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and thank them for the stewardship of the land, air and water that I very much enjoy in my location here. The timing of this event, I think, is very timely. We do have an acute housing crisis, and I'll try and identify some of the causes of that and hopefully some potential solutions. So I think you have a title slide as the first slide. If you could move to the second slide. And that should have the title on the side of Understanding the Crisis.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, okay. And very quickly, just to say there are long-term structural causes to this that go back probably 30 to 40 years. Certainly, some of the challenges began in the 1970s, and some of the policy decisions made at that time continue to echo in the nature of the current crisis. And then I think, as Nicole has so clearly identified, there's some short-term exacerbating issues that are very much overlaying on top of that long-term structural pattern to become very urgent and pressing problems in their own right. Okay, next slide, please. So what are those long-term structural issues? Well, I think it's largely to do with the failure of the social and affordable housing supply. Just a little historical note, between 1945 and 1956, the federal government built 670,000 homes as part of the post-war recovery and settlement, ensuring that people had adequate housing. That's a precedent that I think is essential for us to understand as to what is possible if a government makes up its mind to do something. And that was achieved against the background of an acute shortage of materials and an acute shortage of skilled labour. But points the way to potential solutions for our current problem. In the 1970s, there was a major shift in housing policy, regardless of the government of the day or the political party in control. and it was to really promote home ownership, the great Australian dream, as the key housing strategy, and a gradual but noticeable diminution of the federal government commitment to social housing, which meant that the social housing stock has fallen quite noticeably and constantly since the 1970s. If we take 6% as the benchmark figure, really as a minimum requirement for any nation to have as social housing provision, Australia had that last in 1997. It's currently 4%, and that compares very unfavourably with, for example, 17% in the UK, and in some European Union and Scandinavian countries, over 30% of the housing stock is social and affordable housing. So Australia well below global standards there. Next slide.
Yep.
Okay. Lots of arguments in the literature and in the research on what the current shortfall is. Minimally, it's 500,000 units. Various estimates by the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute suggest it could be as high as 750,000 units by 2030. That is a huge problem. I'll give a couple of statistics. They're pretty meaningless because the homelessness figure is just an estimate and is generally considered to be a vast underestimate. And waiting lists are notoriously unreliable. They do contain people who no longer require housing, but more importantly, they don't contain many people who, as Nicole said, are in that 30% of income housing stress, but because of the known waiting lists, don't bother registering because they know that they would not receive a home in anything under 10 years. So there's a vast underestimate there in terms of waiting lists. Figures are there, but as I say, they're pretty serious underestimates. New South waiting list, I think, is currently around 60,000. The other thing that's happened, because of it's such a scarce resource, the allocation is on the basis of need. And in 2021, 86% of the people allocated to the community housing organisation sector were in the greatest need category. For state social housing, that was 81%. That means a process of residualisation has occurred, and the pattern of social housing is changing dramatically. From the families, the working families of the 1960s and 1970s, we now find the vast majority of people in social housing are unable to work for a whole range of reasons, and are in the poorer segments of Australian society. That residualisation does mean higher levels of housing stress, difficulty sustaining tenancies, higher levels of antisocial behaviour, and generally what has been described as an ambulance service by one of the AHUVI reports, that we are literally just caring for those in greatest need rather than giving a comprehensive housing service that serves the whole population. Okay, next slide, please. Yep. To that long-term and structural pattern, we add some short-term issues. Post-COVID housing market has been extremely active, contrary to all the predictions at the beginning of the pandemic that the housing market would collapse. It's gone in the opposite direction. 20% housing price increases in some jurisdictions, quite common. There's been a pattern of migration to the regions from the cities. Newcastle has experienced that, as I think Nicole mentioned. There's a private sector rental crisis in terms of supply. And I've got a figure for Newcastle, which when I last checked, I think was 0.7. I think Nicole mentioned 0.8, but it's under 1%. It's the lowest vacancy rate that I've ever seen anywhere, and that's critical. Nicole mentioned the rent rises. If you're lucky enough to be in a rental, you are highly likely to have your rent increased. sometimes by as much as 20%. So that's very much affecting who, the level of homelessness, and of course who is homeless. And we're increasingly seeing families and older women particularly finding themselves homeless. This is at crisis proportion. It's hard to know how some of those stories that Nicole told us can be justified in any society that regards itself as fair and at least pays lip service to the idea of housing equity. It is a scandal and a shame on the country as a whole and on the communities we live in at this level of homelessness. And those types of stories can be told with such regularity. And it is a national issue. It isn't a city issue. It's rural, it's remote, it's regional, it is everywhere. And I'm sure some of the audience will have personal experience of some of these issues. Okay, next slide, please. Do we have solutions? With a colleague at Home in Place, we published a report back in November of last year that said basically that the pattern of the crisis and the size of it and the nature of it had reached a tipping point. And that tipping point was that state governments no longer have the capacity to do what's required. And they no longer have the funding or the capability to solve the housing crisis. And that was at a time when federal government was very firmly putting everything back onto the states to resolve and saying that housing was a state issue. The central argument I would put is that this requires federal intervention and a national strategy. It also requires a major building program of social and affordable housing. Nicole mentioned the NRAS scheme, which has been successful, has housed around about 15,000 people or units, and done that very successfully at the subsidised rental programme. But that was effectively scrapped by the Abbott government. It's only the residual run-through of properties acquired before that time that really is now exiting the programme. So again, a very clear policy implication. I think it requires a reset of the taxation models, particularly negative gearing and capital gains exemptions. These have set the housing market as an investment market rather than a housing market. Housing is seen as an asset rather than a home. And this is a cultural issue that really influences the whole pattern of the problem, and particularly the lack of affordability in the market, which then trickles down into the rental market, eventually impacts housing for low-income families and homelessness at the lowest element of that housing continuum. It also requires a major partnership between federal, state and local government. And every level of government has a contribution to make to the solution. Federal in terms of funding a massive building programme, state in terms of organising that, and local government, I think, in terms of access to land and planning and all the localisation factors that will be essential to deliver a major housing programme. I think there's also a key role for civil society, that's you, me, and all the non-governmental organisations that can contribute. And obviously I work for one in terms of Home in Place, formerly Campus Housing. And some of the solutions will lie in experimentation and new models. Current policies, well, we had about 10 years of the federal government ignoring the problem and passing it back to the states. The new Labour government has assumed responsibility. That word used, I think, by the Housing Minister this week. For the first time in that 10 years, we have a Housing Minister. Previously, there were 7 ministers had some role to play in solving housing issues and administering the housing system, which meant basically chaos and a totally uncoordinated approach. We have been promised a national plan, and the the new government has established the Housing Australia Future Fund, which is a $10 billion fund that it doesn't spend 10 billion, but it uses the interest from 10 billion to build more homes. And they have set a target of 30,000 homes, 20,000 of them in the next 5 years. And there is a specific allocation of 4,000 to those exiting and experiencing domestic violence, 10,000 for key workers like teachers, nurses, emergency workers, etc. And there's a 1.7 billion general commitment to housing for women, and that is particularly that domestic violence component and older women. So, next slide, please. Sorry, have I got you caught up with me on the slides?
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Yeah, good, great. Okay, so big question, is it enough? Well, it's very welcome, and it's a major policy shift, but it is insufficient to meet even conservative estimates of need. What is required is a response at the level of that post-World War II programme. Those 670,000 homes built over a 10, 12-year period. That precedent tells us it's possible. That precedent tells us that it just requires commitment of all levels of government and civil and non-governmental organisations, and we can achieve that again. And it is that level of solution that's required. I think it requires an ideological shift away from home ownership as the key policy driver for housing policy. I think that's become embedded to an extent, but of course it's now it's no longer the dream can no longer be realised. Major diminution of home ownership, particularly in the age range under 40, and that's fallen by I think about 16% since the 1980s, which shows how difficult it is to actually become a homeowner. And of course, it requires major and better protections for those in the private rental market. I think we need to support alternative civil society measures to create housing. Housing diversity in the market is absolutely essential, but generally that's fairly marginal in impact. And whilst I strongly favour experimentation to achieve that diversity, it isn't going to solve the problem in the kind of timescale that we really need to do this in. The only solution I can see is a parallel with that post-World War II programme, whether here in Australia, in Canada, in the United States, in the UK, in most of Europe, in all of Scandinavia, that programme in that period met the housing need of the population. And we are at such a crisis point globally that I cannot see how we can do it without that. And part of the background here, I think, is the general dominance of neoliberal ideology and social policy, which has relegated the provision of housing to the market. And I think my ending point will be that the market has failed and it requires major governmental intervention to bring this to a solution that's sufficiently timely and at sufficient scale to meet the needs and the right to housing of all Australia's citizens and indeed all global citizens. And so I will end at that point. Thank you.
Thanks, David, and certainly raised some interesting policy questions that I think some of our members will be asking about at the end of Sidsel's presentation tonight. So I'll hand over to Sidsel now. Okay.
Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Yes, good evening. My name is Sidsel Grimstad. I'm a lecturer. Oh, okay, all right, speak up. Okay, my name is Sidsel Grimstad. I'm a lecturer at the Newcastle University, at the Newcastle Business School. As you can hear from my accent, I'm Norwegian. And my first house was a housing co-op. My mother lives in a housing co-op. My son lives in a housing co-op. My brother lives in a housing co-op. So while we think that these are alternative models, they are actually very mainstream in many countries. And that's, in a way, in a short, brief version of what I'm going to talk about. It's an alternative model of housing, but it's not like an experiment. It's quite mainstream in many places. But it could be part of the Australian dream. It looks like it's jumping something, is it? Okay. All right. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Australian context, but I mean, we've heard a lot about that now. But there are some particular issues that I think are relevant when I want to talk about housing co-ops and co-housing models. Then I'll try to explain what the housing co-op is, because there's a lot of myths about what housing co-ops are. Like, are they, intentional communities where you have to live out in the bush, or what are they really? So especially in the Australian context, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of what this kind of housing model is. And I'll give you a little overview of how mainstream housing co-ops are in other countries, just to kind of get that understanding. And then I'll look at what could be issues of implementing housing co-ops here in Australia, and what are the opportunities. So the Australian housing market is characterized as a duopoly. So it's either private rental or private ownership. And there's a tiny little social housing sector. And because we talk about these being financialized types of housing, so housing is seen as an investment. You are either you're either renting out your house, or you're owning your house and you're waiting for that house to increase in value, so to speak, and less focus on it being a home. That makes this housing market very hot, and this is what we're seeing now when rental prices are increasing, when house prices are increasing, and we are leaving behind a lot of people in the housing market. And the impact of this, we see that a lot more people are not able to buy their own houses, and a lot more people are homeless. And I mean, the previous speakers have talked a lot about this, so I'll skip this. And only I want to stress that cooperative housing could be a middle way, where it's like a part of the housing sector that is outside investment. If you can get that into your head now, I will explain more. So cooperative housing is a type of housing where you are a member of a cooperative. And as a member, you can either rent a dwelling or you can own your dwelling. So we distinguish between rental co-ops and equity-based co-ops. It means also that the whole... Oh. Okay. Yeah. It means that as a member, you have a right to live in that house or in that dwelling, as long as you don't what should I say, do something illegal, or you pay your rent basically. So your tenure is secure. It also means that you still have to pay a little bit of rent to the co-op so that they maintain the co-op. But each co-op is an independent economic unit. So it has to be a sustainable housing complex. Hello? Hello? Yes, hello? Yep, okay. So cooperative housing is a tenure model. That's important to distinguish between what we call co-housing. A co-housing model is a design model. I won't talk so much about co-housing, but it is an interesting model because it can make housing cheaper. In a co-housing model, you share some facilities like laundries, garden sheds, tool sheds, gardens, and so on, and that can make housing cheaper in a way. So, but it's a design model. Co-op housing is a tenure model. Cooperative housing can also service particular purposes, and we see that actually in the housing co-ops that exists in Australia, many of them have been established for a special purpose. A particular ethnic community wanted to live together, senior co-op housing, LGBTQI communities wanted to live together, and so on. So you have a bit more say of who you want to live with. And support from. So I'm going to talk a bit more about equity-based co-ops. Equity-based co-ops is in a way market-based. Price is set by the market, but it's generally lower than market price of private housing because it's considered by some a disadvantage to not own it fully. But it also, in a equity-based co-op, you still have, the cooperative still owns the building and is responsible for maintenance to maintain a non-degrading standard of housing. So that's legislated according to housing cooperative acts all over Europe. You have to maintain the standard of housing in co-op housing. And so you have to set aside a certain part of your rent to maintain that standard of housing. That's why you see even in housing co-ops in Copenhagen, for instance, which are meant for social housing, the housing quality is maintained because of these legislated maintenance standard. There are, even in equity-based co-ops, you can make entry level into co-ops a bit easier by integrating rent to buy programs or lower price for young members and so on. So there are new models happening in Europe, even in these what we call equity-based or market-based cooperatives. Throughout this presentation, I'm showing you pictures of actually what co-ops look like. So this is a picture of a housing co-op in Oslo, quite new one in central Oslo. Most of these housing co-ops are small flats, so 1 to 2 bedrooms, because that's the need. So they don't have very limited number of large flats because this is the need both for older people and for young people. And singles, single mothers, single parents and so on. We also have what we call rental co-ops, so where you are a member, gives you the right to rent a flat in a co-op or a house in a co-op. This picture, as you can see, I'm also part of that picture. This is actually from a rental co-op in Sydney. It's a co-op that was established 27 years ago by a Filipino refugee community. And they're doing very well. They've managed to save up some money and invest in more houses that they've built out their co-op. And so we see that the agency that is created through a cooperative housing model where the tenants or the co-op members are expected to take part in governing their housing and make decisions over maintenance and investments and so on, can create a lot of agency and community around around housing. This particular community, the Kapit Bayan housing co-op, during the pandemic, they were really instrumental in providing food for all the international students in the area because they were left stranded with no food and no support. And we saw the garages were full of food, and they just knew they connected with all the ethnic communities in the area. So I think having a housing system that creates governance systems where you get together and make decisions around how you want to live, I think that's really important. Without it being necessarily an intentional community, it can be very practical, decent, good housing that creates community feeling. Rental and co-op housing is, of course, maybe the most what should I say, appropriate for low-income groups, and often, especially in the rental co-op housing in Australia, the rent is capped at I think around 30% of their household income, as in other, I guess, social housing providers. So this is an example from Denmark, a co-housing model. So the Danish were very early on with what they called senior co-housing co-ops. And as you can see, there's small kind of one-store flats around in a big space, and then the middle house is a community house where you have shared facilities. You share gardens and so on. This little research article is quite interesting because it talks about how people, the age group that moved into this senior co-housing project they were around 60 and above, and they all said we've gained new friends and been more social than we've ever been after we moved into this co-housing co-op. So I guess the research results here was about the mental health and the reduced isolation that this kind of living arrangement has created. I'm missing some slides. Okay, here we go. I should have showed you this video early, but I'll show it. So this is a little short video about, co-op housing. I wanted to briefly talk about how mainstream this co-op housing model is in other countries. So as David also mentioned that social housing in other countries has up to 30%, for instance in Scandinavia, but most of that is actually housing co-ops. So for instance, Denmark, which I consider the most what should I say, social housing minded country, I think, in Europe almost, because they have such a large proportion of social housing and they are rental co-ops. 20% of the housing stock is what we call rental co-ops, and where the rent is actually affordable. And again, maintenance is legislated, so quality should not decline. And that's and this has been they have built these rental co-ops over a long period of time, and a small part of the rent also goes into a national housing development fund. And this housing development fund is now big and functions as a revolving fund. It both acts as a guarantor for new development and can also be used to finance directly new development. And because this is non-profit private organization, so the National Housing Development Fund constructs a housing co-op, let's say, and it's a rental co-op. The members start paying their rent and they pay down on their loan. But each flat, each complex of flat is a separate economic unit. And so they, and it means that because they are non-profit private housing providers, they can't be touched by politicians. And this is actually quite a big point, because there's a lot of politicians who wanted to have a say on how to spend the National Housing Development Fund, but because they're in their statutes, it has always been for social housing and for rental co-ops. And that's the way it's going to be in the future as well. So it's quite, I am very, Denmark is absolutely a country that's worth studying. Secondly, they also have quite a large sector of equity co-ops, which is 15%. So in all, 35% of the housing stock are housing co-ops. So the interesting thing, for instance, in Copenhagen, you can have rental co-ops side by side by private ownership, side by side by equity-based co-ops. Okay? And private rental maybe even. So you can have that in the same block in Copenhagen. And this makes for Copenhagen's fantastic diversity of people. When you walk around in Copenhagen and see that there's diversity of people. And I think that's a really important element of community building as well. We have full equity co-ops in Norway and Sweden mostly. They are big sectors as well, 22% in Sweden, 14% in Norway. Germany is 5%. They have both rental co-ops, similar to Denmark. But they also have this newer concept which is called Baugruppen, where people get together and decide, hire an architect, and get finance themselves and build something that they would like to live in, so to speak, which is often more environmentally sound and so on. Australia, back to Australia. I'm part of a large research group that are studying Australian housing co-ops, and we have been recruited by the Australian cooperative housing providers or peak bodies in South Australia, West Australia, Victoria and New South Wales to try to explore what are the real social values of housing co-ops in Australia. So we're not taking international research, we're doing our own research here. And you know, housing co-ops in Australia is really an invisible model that is still actually, well, I wouldn't say it's thriving because it's much less than 1%. But there are around 200 housing co-ops here in Australia, rental co-ops, so social housing. Around 4,800 units are organized in housing co-ops. And so it will be really important to see, to get data out of that, how they work, how we can support them, what are the problems, what are the opportunities to expand that sector. Because I do think that having a sector which is outside speculation, I think that's important for the future. Certainly in the Scandinavian countries where housing co-ops are so big, it means that Airbnb is not allowed, for instance. You can't rent out a housing co-op unit because you have to live in the unit. So it's owner-occupier. So you cannot invest in a housing co-op unit. So it means that a part of the housing sector is outside that kind of speculation. And that's, I think that can be an interesting model to explore. How can we make that sector bigger so that we avoid this pressure of renting out and increasing rents and increasing and price gauging? Yeah. We don't know actually how many equity co-ops are in Australia. We think it's very, very few, but it doesn't. Those numbers don't exist. So basically, I believe that I think there is an interest in co-housing, cooperative housing in Australia now because they might offer affordable and safe housing or tenure security. They do create social cohesion and living communities, and we are hoping to get data that can prove this once and for all, and also the health benefits of living more communally. I think it also creates urban local democracy, more vigor in the cities. And also more, when we get together and decide on how we want to live, we also try to improve our surroundings. And that goes not only to our little unit, it goes to our garden and then maybe bigger to the whole community we live in. So this is actually a picture of a cooperative housing in Hobart, Cascade. Has been there for a long time. It also social housing, mostly single parents, and it's amazing how it has actually helped the residents there get their life back together. They've helped each other get education, jobs, and also the governance training that they all take part in has helped them advance in their jobs. So. Stucco, I don't know if you know about that. That's a student accommodation in Sydney. It's famous for being quite radical and but also very social justice minded. A lot of young people have learned a lot about governance also living there. We also have Narara Eco Village here down in Central Coast. That's also a housing co-op, which is interesting. They have open days. I think we are struggling in Australia regarding implementing housing co-ops because there's a lot of lack of knowledge around housing co-ops as a model. We think there's lots of myths and stereotypes around what the housing co-op is, and I think housing co-op can be just any kind of house in a way, but it's the way you govern and participate in how you want to live together with your community around it. I think up until now there has not been a strong desire either for housing co-ops. But I think in this housing affordability crisis, I think the Australian public is probably more open to finding other solutions, and especially trying to get out of the financialized markets and finding other solutions. And I think that's also more attractive for younger people. Young people are more interested in living more communally, finding more sustainable housing solutions, and don't mind sharing more than maybe we did. But it's not without its challenges. I think legislation is problematic in Australia. I think it doesn't enable cooperative ownership. In Norway, for instance, you have a title when you have a housing complex. You have a title for the co-op, and then you have individual titles for the units that you own or rent. And so there's some lack of legislation, which then inhibits funding. And I think that's a nut we have to crack. And I think if there's an adequate pressure on this nut, we can. There seems to be more movement. I think for instance, I think some of these suggestions of shared equity is perfect for finding cooperative solutions. That's been suggested both by Labour Party, federal Labour, and also state Liberal government here. So I think maybe, and I know that the cooperative peak body has said, don't forget cooperative housing in finding solutions around the shared equity model. Because you can think about maybe long-term investors wanting to invest in cooperative models that don't probably give such high profit margins as investment in private rental or home ownership, but co-op housing could give longer-term returns, but not instant returns. And it's also the last one is, which is linked to the legislation. Maybe it scares some Australians to have collective property rights. I think in Europe, it's deep down, it's more common to us to have. We have commons, we have co-ops. It's not so alien to us, but when you scrape in the surface around in Australia, you've had lots of co-ops. Australia has a very proud co-op history, and it's just sad that it's so invisible, because they are still there and they're still thriving. You just need to become aware of it. Okay, thank you. I should show you the research project, of course. Yes. Articulating value in cooperative housing, which is together with Swinburne and the University of Western Sydney. So watch this space.
I think that was a really challenging couple of presentations on the different faces of the housing crisis that we're experiencing today. And it's interesting to know that I think some of the descriptions that David gave were, the sort of post-war thing, short materials, short of skilled labour. But it seems to me that the common thing, and I think both of you mentioned this, that there was a commitment to do something about it. And maybe that's one of the big pieces of the missing puzzle, a commitment to do something about a range of different models in housing. So I might hand over to you now. Grab one of those microphones that works. And I just wondered if anyone wants to start with a question. There's one down there.
Can you hear me? Okay. My name is Howard Bridgman. I'm also from the University of Newcastle, but in a totally different field. Last night, my Rotary Club had a talk by a lady from a local church organization who was involved in helping homeless people and people living in cars and actually supporting them by providing an area for them to park in and showers and other things like that. And a number of other organizations are doing the same thing. Now, in terms of social housing, let's suppose we had 100 people in a situation like that, and you wanted to create or organize a cooperative environment for them. From scratch, how long would it take to organize perhaps something like this for those 100 people to be able to move into a cooperative social environment housing complex? How long would it take in Australia? By the way, I reserve right for follow-up comment.
Blue? Yep. Well, I can't answer that. But, I think to develop, first of all, you need probably a developer who wants to build a building. So, if you are very resource poor, I don't think you are able to then build a house, for instance. So you would have to, there would have to be some kind of existing building or development of a building. But then the issue is, if you want to organize it as a co-op, you need support to educate people and help people organize, and take part in governance and decision making, and that's why part of the cooperative principles is also education. And in countries where co-op housing sectors are quite large, they have regular training courses. How do you organize a general assembly? How do you elect new community members? So it's a bit of support.
In other words, several years.
Yes.
Okay. In reality, in Australia, we have a very different lifestyle in many ways than you have in Scandinavia. And trying to get Australians to think in the concept, except for your examples, of social housing in general is going to be difficult. Okay. So we're not really talking about a short-term solution here. And in many of the examples we've been talking about here, we're not looking at short-term solutions, are we? The tenancy problem, the increased rents, and other things like that. Now, I have a question, if you don't mind, follow-up for David. One more? Okay, I understand. David, could you clarify, please, your comments about the changing of legislation for capital gains and depreciation? What do you mean by that for landlords? Because landlords have problems too. In terms of how would that change the structure of the affordability for housing for people?
The point I would make there, I think, refers to something that Sidsel said as well about the financialization of housing. And the incentive at the moment is for investment in the rental market, particularly because of the negative gearing rules that allow you to offset any losses from your rental properties against your general taxation. And also then if you sell that property, you only pay 50% of the capital gains tax on it. If you look at the subsidies required to do that, or the foregone revenue, it amounts to something like £65 billion per year. Now, to resolve the housing crisis, the general estimate is that it would be about £10 billion per year for 10 years. So there's an equity issue. We vastly subsidize private ownership. We barely subsidize private rental or social housing. Total social housing expenditure in Australia, generously calculated, is about 5.4 billion per year. It's literally crumbs off the table of housing subsidy. So for me, it's a huge equity issue. It's also a market dysfunction. It distorts the market towards investment and prevents first-time buyers, particularly entering that market, because markets are full of investors with capital at the ready. So it's a market distortion. It has no parallel in any other country that I've ever looked at in terms of housing. Negative gearing. New Zealand had a similar but less generous model, which they have recently abolished. But beyond that, as far as I'm aware, it is unique. And it is an incredibly generous subsidy to investors.
A question for David. My name is Bruce Taggart, and look, thanks everyone. Thanks to the speakers for the presentations. They've been very informative. David mentioned that there are about 700,000 homes constructed after World War II. given that I grew up during the baby boom years, those houses, from my perception, were pretty basic. 3 bedrooms, not many mod cons. How would you see today's expectations when most people want a McMansion that fills the block, fitting into your social housing construction model?
I think the aspirations for the very many people on the waiting list is just to have a good, safe, secure home where the tenure is secure. Modern construction techniques, particularly off-site manufacture of housing, modular housing built in factories, we could produce housing at a very significant cost saving to traditional construction methods. And those houses can be sustainable. They can be easy to cool in summer, easy to heat in winter. We are now in the 21st century, and we don't have the same construction techniques as we did in 1945. I genuinely believe that we could initiate a massive building program. The other thing I would say that coming out of that is that actually recreated the Australian economy in 1945 into the 50s. The housing boom was an absolute foundation of the post-war recovery. And so the economic benefits of a major house building program in terms of employment, GDP, growth of the economy generally, it's an enormous opportunity that we're currently missing.
Thank you. Roger Hampson, thank you for three speakers. Speaking about the cooperatives, you were talking about Australians this, Australians that. What about new Australians? You're talking about how common this is in Europe and particularly Scandinavia. These people we have lots of Scandinavians here in Newcastle, in fact. They should be familiar with this concept. They will have developers, the whole small economic infrastructure is there for such a group of people to do this very thing you're talking about. Has that been looked at? Thank
you. Well, that's what we're looking at. But yes, and as I said, of the 200 housing co-ops that exist, and primarily they are in Victoria and New South Wales, a large proportion of them are actually come out of ethnic communities. Not so much Scandinavian. I haven't seen a Scandinavian one, but interestingly, the Filipino one that I showed a picture of, they were very knowledgeable about cooperatives. One of the residents had done a master on cooperative business models from Philippines. So he was an expert and he trained other co-ops establishing around in Sydney. So yeah, that's a resource for sure.
I've just got one question of Nicole. I just wanted to get a sense of how willing landlords and I suppose real estate agents are to understand the needs of their tenants in the circumstances that they're in today, and do you get much luck getting through to them about what the needs are rather than what the rules are that they think that they can abide by? So I guess, is there a sense of hope that you can get wins?
No. I had a conversation with a property manager in a social setting, and what she said is, well, my landlords have increasing costs, and they need to, if they can, why would you not increase the rent when I've got someone who's willing to pay it? So there isn't a great, and I'm not saying that this is every landlord, and some landlords do come back to real estates and say, no, I'm not going to take your recommendation of increasing the rent for by $100. That's not okay. So yes, there are people that take that on, but I would say it's rare.
Yeah, I just wanted to also mention the issue of what should I say, cost saving in cooperative housing. That's part of our research project as well. We're going to have a look at how what should I say, tenant participation or active participation in decision making might reduce costs of living and also of housing. I just wanted to answer the gentleman who was talking about the first question about the housing model. I'm insecure housing costs Australian society so much, and we shouldn't forget that. Individual wealth can increase, but societal wealth decreases by not giving people secure housing, and the long-term impact of that on the next generation is terrible. I don't think we can accept it.
Thank you for those answering the questions to our speakers. I think one of the things that comes out from tonight is about what we can do. And I think it was mentioned as part of a civil society, what can we do? And maybe we can go away and think about what we can do to pressure our governments to take this more seriously. It seems that we have a government at the moment, at least nationally, and to some extent at state levels. I've noticed the Victorian announcements recently, and I think Matt Keane from New South Wales is interested in different models. So maybe we as citizens and a group like this can start to pressure these people to look at a range of housing models and support people in doing them, both in legislation, policy and funding options to support people explore these models. So please join me in thanking Nicole, Sidsel and David in Adelaide for participating in this discussion. I'm sorry I ended up in a bit of a gloomy question there, but I think it's been a really interesting discussion on such an important topic. So please join me in thanking them for giving their time. The Newcastle Institute is focused on public policy discussion, and we that have been involved often wonder where we're going in terms of, what difference does it make? We want to have the discussion, and we haven't moved on from doing anything else about it. But Sidsel and I had a conversation today, and she said, did you know it was the Newcastle Institute that put me in touch with Andrew Scott from the Australian Institute, because we had a similar housing forum 5, 6 years, I don't know how, it was certainly pre-COVID. And you mentioned to him about the cooperative models, and they've, since that contact, have produced a significant report on these alternative models. So we call that a win for the Newcastle Institute, who's striving to have this public policy discussion. We thank you for your attendance tonight. September, slight change, because we're having it on the third Wednesday of the month. And it's around the merger of the Greater Bank and the Newcastle Permanent Building Society, and the impact, how that's going to happen, and the impact on competition and those sorts of things. October, we're having James Curran. James is the son of Bernie Curran, the late Bernie Curran, who was our patron. So it's appropriate that we have James here, and he'll be focusing on China. And in November, and we're having he was a patron, lifetime member, Michael Ondarchi, and many of you have been here at these events when Michael has spoken every year since, probably every 2 years since 2008, on the American politics, and we've had some discussion, and he's looking about the questions about, is America in decline? For those who haven't heard Michael speak, we highly recommend that you come along and tell people to come along, because it's just such an interesting discussion perspective on the craziness of American politics. So thank you. Enjoy your rest of your night. And again, thank you to the speakers.